Hello, everyone. This is Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and welcome to today's webinar, Preparing for 2021, Changes Publishers Can Make to Embrace Opportunities in Our New World. This webinar, which is sponsored by Virtue Sales, features Patricia Stockland, who's going to lead a discussion on how to identify the changes that need to happen in your particular business. And she's going to offer a crash course on the importance of both managing change and how to navigate successful change management. Patricia Stockland is actually the founder and CEO of Kind World Publishing and Consulting. She's well known to BISG. She's as a seasoned executive in children's publishing. She served and led change and growth initiatives as publisher for Capstone, VP and editor-in-chief for Lerner Publishing Group, and editorial director for Redland Editorial, among other roles. She's the author of over 80 books and has edited and conceived many more. Her expertise spans both creative work and continuous improvement across operations. This webinar itself has been generously sponsored by our member company, Virtue Sales. And joining us today from Virtue Sales in a conversation with Patricia after her presentation is Rodney Elder, who's Executive Vice President North America at Virtue Sales Publishing Solutions. Rod is one of the real supporters of BISG, and he and his company played a critical role in bringing our rights white paper to fruition earlier this year. It's a critical piece of assessment of the return on investment for smart management of rights and rights data. And certainly it's available on the BISG website, and it will also be available after this for anyone who's attended this webinar. I'd like to start by turning things over to Patricia to both present your point of view on change and change management, and invite both Patricia and Rod to engage in a conversation afterwards. Everybody will have a chance to ask questions. If you've not been on our webinars before, you'll see a box on the right that allows you to submit a question. I'll be tracking those throughout the webinar, and we'll come back to them in the last 15 minutes or so. So Patricia and Rod, thank you for being here, and Patricia, over to you.
Thank you, Brian, for that very kind introduction, and also thank you, Virtue Sales, for providing a conversation platform for me to discuss one of my favorite subjects, which is change. I will start with a few quick disclosures and disclaimers here that I tend to speak really quickly, especially when I'm excited or nervous, and I am both this morning. So please bear with me as I try not to jam 3 hours of information into our first 30 minutes or so of our time together. And on that note, thank you for your time and joining us this morning, everyone. It is our most valuable resource, and I hope that you find this information useful as we dig into things. As Brian said, if you have questions as we go along, send those in, and we'll try our best to address them in the Q&A and in the conclusion. So let's see if I can get this slide deck moving here. All right. So change management amid unrelenting change. I think it is fair to say we are awash in a sea of change right now. And that's probably an understatement. Two themes that you're going to hear reoccurring today are conscientiousness and seeking opportunities. And I really think it's true that we can choose to be terrified of this much change around us, or we can choose to manage it as conscientiously as possible and try to find opportunities within it. That can be obviously difficult, which is why we're digging into this subject. But one of the things I have found consistently in this as well, especially in our industry, is a need to let go of perfectionism. So that's something that you'll be hearing me talk about a bit today as well. With all of that, let's start here. It's really easy to get swept up in the idea of change when there's so much happening around us, but change for the sake of change isn't necessarily helpful. And I think we've all probably lived through some version of that. And so in navigating this work, it's really, really critical to understand your why and be able to gut check your vision on things. And in determining where you're going with change, having that to return to is really, really important. And so I want to spend this session a little bit in two parts, some philosophical and some tactical. And we're going to start in the philosophical with this vision and really trying to get to some understanding of what that 2021 vision should look like. And I do think it should be a combination of reflection on 2020 and some acknowledgement of what typical publishing challenges we had before 2020, in the before times, and then also a bigger goal that lies beyond 2021. And bringing those three things together is really what's going to help us dig into a vision that makes sense as that North Star for us. My apologies as I navigate here. So little dark cloud, this is not intended to be a graphic indicating 2020, but if that's how you want to interpret it, by all means. This year has been so much, obviously. And so starting by getting our bearings through this Q&A activity I kind of have teed up for us is going to help us get into that reflection piece of it, and so we can put these things together. So some 2020 reflection questions that I have really get into a space of thinking about the 2020 vision you may have had before the pandemic, and what became of that as you pivoted through your pandemic response. And spending some time thinking about that also can lead you to dig into what needs to evolve in your business based on how you worked your way through those pivots. What have you already had to reset for 2021 and beyond? Also thinking too about what your sales responses have been, both positive and negative. You may have been surprised by what your buyers and customers were saying about your company's response to the pandemic, and there's definitely something you can dig into from there and build from. Obviously, a reoccurring theme for folks in a lot of corners has been whether you've been able to fully exploit the rights that you hold. Some people were set up really well to be response ready on this, and others not so much. There were supply chain disruptions that needed navigation, of course, and then ebook and audio sales. What did those look like for you? Also, what new partners and vendors arose that you needed? What were you seeking for resources to bridge some of these gaps? Did you already have flexible systems and tools in place that your remote team was able to use to work together as a single unit? Or were you scrambling to get hardware, for example, so people could do their jobs away from the office? Did your overall productivity increase, decrease, or maintain prior levels? What has your team shared with you? How is overall morale? And I think this is a big question that's really worth panning out and taking a little time with. And this gets into some of the squishy stuff, but it isn't just about the systems we have in place and the processes we have in place that maybe helped us survive or get through 2020. It's of course about that third critical resource of your people, and how are your people doing right now? What innovation is maybe shaken out from all of this, and how is the burnout level? And burnout is a hard thing to talk about, I think, even in good times, but it's absolutely critical that we talk about it in the space that we're in right now, because it is a piece of this pivot, and it should absolutely be a piece of how you're putting together your 2021 vision and beyond. So that is some reflection on 2020, but it is a truth universally acknowledged in times before 2020 that publishing had some bad habits, and many of those are going to exist as we move forward, and they are things that need to be dug into. As strange as it may sound, I think it's actually helpful to think back to our bad habits prior to 2020 as a touchstone of stability. They're a good place to pulse check what your business's needs are in a broader, panned out, fuller picture. And these common challenges really just are that. They're common challenges that I've seen in a number of places and are critical and part of what you need to look at if you're really going to dig into some bigger changes. So what are those? Little sampling of our dirty laundry here. We have a habit of throwing people at problems and using people as the primary source for solutions, and this can create a number of other issues. It's kind of a domino effect, but I think this comes from a few different places. Publishing is a vanity industry, and that makes it easy to, or seemingly easy to, deploy a person rather than a system. But it doesn't mean that deploying a person for something is necessarily the best long-term answer, or maybe even the best short-term answer. And so that's definitely something that needs closer examination. Email updates gone rogue, and this is often something I see in the deficit of systems, shared processes, and role clarity being in balance. And I think it's a good place for all of us to kind of gut check, how is your inbox right now? Email can be used in place of a good process or a good system, but it's not really a sustainable methodology, obviously. Fiefdoms are another problem that I think we struggle with. And again, this happens in a deficit of that systems, people, process balance. And I think it also happens because when people are missing the tools that they need to do their jobs effectively and well, it creates a natural human response of protect what I know, don't rock my boat. I'm doing everything I can right now to try to keep this boat floating, but it doesn't necessarily put us in a place to pivot as quickly as we need to, especially when we're trying to access our data, our information, our IP. And so when you think about starting to put these concepts together of what have we just survived in 2020 and what could have been easier to survive in 2020 had we maybe washed some of this dirty laundry, it starts to paint that bigger picture of what needs to change and why. A few more pieces of our laundry here. Traditional publishing was built on a print first P&L, and a print first P&L wasn't necessarily built to pivot quickly. And so I think for a handful of folks who had already started to move or were well beyond this, 2020 looked differently than it did for those of us who were still trying to figure out what do you do with a print situation first when print isn't necessarily something that can move very quickly, especially if you think back to where we were in the spring with some of the supply chains disrupted and not being able to get things into market that people were hungry for. The last 2 points I have on here are kind of tied together, and there's something I know Brad and I have talked about at length. The first one is the perception that each company has a unique process, and that is also tied into many publishers doing what just it pains me from a project management standpoint, but building a solution to the exception rather than the rule. And the reality is that about 80% of what we do can be and should be standardized from a workflow standpoint, but we can easily get swept up in building solutions to those outliers rather than creating a foundation for the stuff that should be clean and repeatable, and then dealing with those exceptions as they come along. And so if we can do something to address and bust that myth of the unique process, it's really going to help us in a lot of these other areas as well. So the third piece of this in terms of our philosophical place, we've looked at 2020, we're thinking about our past and existing sins, building a bigger goal from this in terms of 21 and beyond. And I think this is really that getting to that holy grail of balance across systems, people, and processes. And again, it's a place where I think doing an exercise in the gray is critical to get there and get it done effectively. And it's really about talking, because the identification for the need for change does not necessarily create a vision for change. And so if you are somebody who's in a place where building a vision is part of your role, or supporting and executing on a vision is part of your role, you have to get underneath that and really talk to your teams. And it's a critical first and repeated step through this process, and clarifying that vision and actually addressing the business needs that you have. You can spend a lot of time reflecting on what happened in 2020. You can spend time thinking about what your business is maybe tangled up in from standard publishing bad habits, but it's really that third component too of looking at what else is going on that helps bring these things together. And the reality, regardless of what you find from all of this, is likely that you need to address a simplification exercise in a lot of ways. Simplification is really imperative to our work, and so too is team empowerment. And so you can bring these two things together by having conversations with key stakeholders across areas and looking at what can be done to make people's jobs easier. We're not very good, and I didn't put this in the bad habits list, but maybe I should have. We're not very good at going back and cleaning up our messes and our processes and whatnot. I think publishing tends to be a hoarding industry. I know it's something that I struggle with because we love knowledge, we love stuff, we love files, we love all the things, we love metadata, and we don't like to let go of that stuff. But that is antithetical to simplifying. We have to clean up and let go of a lot of these steps, or we don't get to that beyond place, which is really about finding that balance. It's really about making sure that it isn't just a people solution, that it's a system in place and a process in place that is working for everybody. And that place is not a destination. It's really moving to an endorsement of continuous improvement. And continuous improvement is a never-ending exercise. And I think it's something we should probably talk about a little bit at the end of this as well, because I can go on quite a while, but I won't. I'll move to my next slide. So we've gotten a little look here at the philosophical, and I think the crash course, as promised, is really putting all these things together. So it begins with a reality check on a lot of where your standard industry challenges are. As I mentioned, looking at if your P&L has evolved beyond that print first model. If it has, have your teams and processes and systems also evolved to reflect that? And with that, are you maximizing opportunities for all sales? Not just through external discoverability, but also internally with creative teams. Something that I think is an interesting challenge for us is whether our creative teams can actually access and get to the various IP that we might hold and be able to brainstorm and think of other things that can be done with content and other information that already exists. And alongside that too, if your team can get to it on the creative side, can your sales team get to it and move on it if there's an opportunity for a new deal when one arises? How quickly can people check on rates and respond, for example? Is your business or team balanced across people, processes, and systems? And where have you built those processes around exceptions rather than the rule? Speaking of processes, how well documented are yours? Are they documented at all? This is not unheard of, but it's helpful to have at least a baseline sense of how you're doing the things you're doing if you're going to start changing how you do those things. With regard to metadata, how up to date are your data and your system, and where is your single source of truth? Who's the keeper of that truth? Does everyone know who the keeper of that truth is? This is really obviously critical, but an absolutely necessary thing to look at when you're panning out and looking at the whole. How clean is your operational flow through? And I think this is a good one to pause on because we also have a tendency to address issues in silos. And if you're thinking about effective change management, it really is necessary to pan out and look at the whole picture, soup to nuts. And that's where that operational flow through question has to be asked. Do you have internal fiefdoms? If so, where are they? And what possibly is missing either in tools or processes that may have led to those things? In my experience, fiefdoms are very rarely, if ever, an individual issue and more likely a symptom of a larger problem there. And lastly, are you running on schedule? And if not, why not? This can be a red flag and maybe the first flag that you see that indicates there's a lot of other stuff that maybe needs to change uphill from there. So after you've looked at those, the next step in digging into this work is conducting internal interviews and really looking around on that. And I think the internal interviews are something that gets overlooked, a step that gets missed sometimes. And that's possibly because it's a time-consuming thing to do, but it's a really useful thing to do. One of the things that it is able to unearth in that is an opportunity to find micro changes, really quick action, quick steps, quick wins that you can get that will start to create energy and momentum. Internal interviews can also help you verify or debunk some of the answers that you've come up with to the questions that I've thrown out there and others. It can be dangerous in change management to start acting on your assumptions before you've validated or invalidated those. And that's where it's really necessary to bring as many people to the table as you can across this type of work if you're going to have effective change management happening. People in these internal interviews can really raise those questions of the business can improve if only we did X, Y, or Z. It's also really important to look for your naysayers. And for anybody who's maybe done an exercise like this, you're thinking to yourself, oh, but so-and-so is so negative and I don't know. And really the naysayers are the first folks that you should be looking to and talking to, because they're really the ones who are probably flagging some serious issues that need to be addressed. I tend to get excited when I have a chance to talk to folks who have identified the problems, because it means they're not just rolling along with the flow necessarily. And the most important part of the internal interview process is it's really a way to strengthen internal trust and rapport. It's showing that you're willing to start digging into issues and listening to what people have to say and gathering information that isn't just change from on high. It's really a buy-in effort that is legitimate and authentic. And authenticity is a piece of this work that I don't think we talk about enough either as an industry. And you'll see in my resources at the end of this, and also in the white paper, if you hop out on the site, that I'm a big Brene Brown fan, and I think we could bring a lot of her work into the industry and benefit greatly from it. All right, so on that note, communication. You're going to start communicating this vision for change before you know everything that needs to be changed. And that's just naturally part of this process. But if you are communicating, here's where we're going, here's what I don't know quite yet, here's what we're going to find out along the way, and I trust that this team can do this work, you're really putting forth some good momentum in getting these things done. And you have to acknowledge that you don't have all the answers, because none of us has all of the answers. Be grateful for the input that you're getting and act on it whenever you can. But communicate. It's so critical. After that, this is really where I would encourage everybody, if you have the opportunity, to bring project management into play and team empowerment. And this work starts with the process first and the people second. And it is tempting when you start looking at your process more closely, or at least it's tempting for me, to want to try to fix all of the things while you're capturing all of the things. And that's not advisable to do it that way. Get your bearings first before you start chipping away, which maybe sounds contradictory to the micro changes, but micro changes are about this big. I'm talking about wanting to change things that are this big or bigger. So this is where I would really encourage conducting a SIPOC to get a complete picture of what your current processes and systems look like, and the roles of the people who are involved in them. And this can get really, really ugly. This is a big, hairy, messy exercise. It's really critical that you have everybody at the table from different parts of that process to get an accurate picture of what happens from when you start to the work to when you deliver the work. When I've been involved in these, it's been really interesting to see how much or how little different departments and areas know about what's actually going on and what their decisions do through a process or through a tool that they may not realize are impacting other areas or people in that process. And again, it's really a nice team building exercise to just dig in and get everything out there. After you've done that, then move to the people. And this is where conducting a RACI can be really helpful, which is responsible, accountable, communicate, inform. And this digs deeper into who is doing what and who's responsible for what. And it's also a good opportunity to do that work of looking at where a people solution might be blocking a faster or better means of executing when you could put a system or cleaner process in place. I'd mentioned on the last slide team empowerment. And this is also an area where once you have roles cleaned up and clarified, it gives you an opportunity to let go of micromanagement. And letting go of micromanagement through all of this is really, really important. And it gets a bit into that perfectionism I warned you I was going to mention. As an industry that leans toward perfectionism, it's something that we have to be conscientious of and looking for both in ourselves and in our teammates, really across the board. Perfectionism slows us down and it gets in the way of effective change management and effective change, because perfectionism stops us from actually delivering. And so through this process, be cognizant of that. Identify key players who can and help want to drive the change, and you will see that in this exercise as well. Again, it gets a little bit to the naysayers I said to seek out before. I really want to encourage you to do that and use this information that you gain through these to look for what your biggest opportunities for improvement actually are. You need to be thinking both big and small. Sometimes those little changes can make a world of difference to how you're executing on things. And finally, make decisions and start moving. In this work of both the SIPOC and the RACI especially, you are going to unearth way more than you can tackle, especially if your team or your company hasn't done this type of work in a while or if ever. And you have to use all of this together to decide what you're going to move on quickly, what you can tackle now, what possibly needs to enact with larger project plans, and what has to wait, because things will inevitably have to wait with all of this. But your overall goal should consistently be a measure of simplification. And with all of this information, it can be it can really get you into analysis paralysis, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I would caution you not to fall into that. Again, analysis paralysis is a symptom of perfectionism. You're going to make some stuff messy. You're going to make mistakes in this work, and effective change management has to do with deciding and moving and correcting course, deciding, moving and correcting course, which is where that North Star is really important, because you're not going to have the entire map laid out before you need to start moving. But you do need to move, and that involves making decisions. And once you've gotten multiple people at the table and you've given people a chance to weigh in, they want and deserve to see action. So make it happen. Again, throughout, keep communicating and celebrate success and failure along the way with that. It's a nice salve for recovering perfectionists to know that it's okay to break stuff as long as you're learning from it and sharing that information and celebrating it. If somebody is trying to do this change management work with you and they've made a mistake, if there's a failure, that means they're leaning in and they're trying to do the work. So that's a great thing to celebrate and keep moving. Don't wait for perfect on it. Continuous improvement is really an exercise in progress instead. So to sum up the crash course of everything I just rambled through, it's really these six steps that I'm showing here. You're gathering that general idea around your assumed collective challenges. You're talking to your team and unearthing their points of view, and really weeding out what of your assumptions is correct or maybe a little off course there. You're creating and communicating your vision from those areas, those combined things, and you're getting that out to folks and you're being straightforward about it. Then you're going to engage project management, get a handle on your process, get a handle on your roles and people, see what tools and systems are missing from those things in terms of how they do their job and their process, analyze and decide what to address, when, how, and with whom, and keep communicating and celebrating throughout. Again, you're kicking off a continuous improvement process with this, so you need to acknowledge it and own it. All right, successful change management, a handful of key takeaways. Even more winnowed down bulleted list here. Clear communication. Keep it consistent, keep it authentic, remove the corporate speak if you can, and create a vision of simplification. Empower your team, embrace authentic leadership, and celebrate and implement micro changes when you find them, and start talking about continuous improvement. I know when Rod and I were talking about continuous improvement earlier, I threw out the example of you can choose to not change the oil in your car, or you can do a little bit along the way and keep that oil changed and not have to eventually replace an entirely burned out engine. Or you can ignore it and have to deal with an entirely burned out engine at some point. So I'm just saying, continuous improvement for the win. All right, that is me talking really, really quickly. I hope that folks have some questions. We'll try to throw out some answers here. I know Rod and I want to discuss a few more of these points with folks. So I think, Rod, if you want to rejoin me.
Absolutely, absolutely.
My breath and take a big old gulp of coffee here.
All right, absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that enlightening review of change management. You know, I've often found over the years that companies only change when they change software systems. And these new processes that they implement at the point of changing the software become entrenched. And they essentially don't change again until they do a big software change. So I think it's like along that analogy of the engine swap out, where, you know, they're missing, it feels like they're missing an opportunity to really continually change and look for things that they could improve on. And just, you know, what are your thoughts on how do you need a project team? So a lot of times you have a software change, you'll implement a project team who will help in implementing software. But then once the software is live, often the team will disband. And so what are your thoughts on keeping teams going, maybe with a different role, but to continually look at how they can change?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Rod. I love great project management teams. So if and when, wherever possible, if folks are able to keep a project management team in place after an implementation, that's obviously great, but it isn't always practical. And so I think an alternative to that is really baking some portion of project management and continuous improvement and documentation really into various roles, into various key stakeholder roles who are involved in that original implementation is a really useful thing to do. And if it can be done in at least a cadence of maybe quarterly check-ins or biannual check-ins so that it doesn't slip and build up, that can help as well. Nobody really loves documentation too much, but it is an important piece of this, because the other thing that can happen, as you're saying, is if it only happens when a system happens, then it can create a slide of 5, 10 years, who knows what, and that's just a huge amount to kind of catch up and clean up and dig into.
Yeah, and I think it's actually, you mentioned the importance of documenting workflows, and I think one of the things that highlights is actually the traditional way of documenting workflows and the way people do business actually can't keep up with continuous improvement and changes in processes. You know, it's one thing to change it, then you've got all of this backlog of documentation that now needs to be updated and changed. And, you know, I often think now that, you know, small, quick, agile documentation, which actually documentation could be a video, and recording a video of someone, you know, going through a process can actually take, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And so people are like, oh, I've got to get a proper recording software and we've got to do it all nice and perfect. But actually, you know, for the purpose of internal, you know, you tweak a change, then someone walks through that process, records it, and people can have quick access to view it, is actually better than having documentation that's, you know, 200 pages long, sitting on a server somewhere that people can't actually, you know, well, they might be able to access, but they don't really feel like accessing 200 pages. So, but maybe a short minute video of walking through a process, but that could be 20 videos that they can go with. That, do you think that'd be more acceptable to people in the
I really do. Yeah, I really do. I love the idea actually of moving it to a video away from the documentation handbook. As you were describing that, it was causing me a flashback to the largest in-house documented process manual and internal house style guide that I'd ever seen, which was I think 500 and something pages long, 514 pages long. It was essentially a combined internal rewrite of the Chicago manual style and a hodgepodge of other things. And at some point it no longer becomes usable, but we are of the YouTube universe now, and I think it really is a nice idea to play on what has become a reflex of, can you go out and get 90 seconds or 3 minutes of information and get a quick handle on how to do something. I don't think people are looking for perfect in that. They're looking for a quick, easy to apply solution, and that really should be a goal that we have. I think that would be great.
Yeah, and I think that sort of the thought of changing all of the documentation actually will limit some people to rolling out changes that they could really benefit from.
Right. Right.
And what are your thoughts in terms of people trying to sell to their bosses about changes? So they're saying, we're doing it this way, but being able to show the boss how could they actually benefit from changing something?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think whenever you can show the problem quickly alongside a proposed solution, that goes a long way in terms of selling upward in the management hierarchy. And often when you can show something where time is being wasted or burned, and I think, managing data is one of those as a good working example, especially if you don't have a good system in place to manage that. If you have data going in repeated places, if you have 3 or 4 people entering the same information somewhere, when you could alternatively have a one and done stabilized solution for that has some obvious improved ROI tied to it right there, because it's a point that you could be cleaning up. And then it begs the question, where else is something like that happening? So being able to show those types of things to your manager, to your boss, really opens the door for a larger conversation around what else are we doing like this? What else could we improve? I believe it's Envato has a really good cost calculator out there as well, and I believe I have that in the resource slide here, where you can plug in some of these things and get some hard numbers on how much time you're burning through that you don't necessarily need to be.
Yeah, I think it's interesting about being able to, if you look at people, a lot of, tasks that people need to do, and it's a lot of repetitive data entry. And, I don't think that was on their role description when they took the job. And so it's really, what are the creative things and more proactive things that people can be doing, but people just end up having to accept that, hey, my job is having to key this in here, key that in there. But really, if people could adopt a better process, it might help us in actually allowing me to do the job that I was hired to do.
Right, right.
And I guess, some of that does come down to, there's this chicken and egg where, sometimes you'll have a company that comes in, they said, look, we'll design you these new beautiful workflows and processes, and this change is going to be amazing. But then there's actually no tools to actually implement that change. So, how important is it, do you find, to implement the change, understanding either the tool that you're going to have or the tools that you do have, as opposed to just, making blue sky sort of agile changes that can't actually be actioned?
That's a good question. I think if I'm understanding it correctly, it's really that dilemma of bringing in people who are solving for bits and pieces rather than the whole. Is that a fair way to?
Yeah, that and also just, you might have someone go, they'll come in and say, look, this is the most optimal workflow that you could implement at your company. And then you're like, well, we don't have anything that can allow us to do that. So then you've got to go and try and find something that allows you to do that, but nothing will be perfect. Where sometimes it's the other way around, where you might find something that you think is really good, but then designing the most optimal workflows for a tool that you have available.
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg question in some way, and I think it gets to a deeper underlying issue, and that is our industry ability or willingness or inability or unwillingness to to change our internal processes to utilize or really maximize an off-the-shelf solution that might be out there. And that is unfortunate if that is the case, but it doesn't make it impossible. It really just gets into that issue of how do you communicate change once you've decided to start addressing these things, and how are you going to help your team or help yourself embrace the idea of doing your work maybe in a different way, but with a tool that solves a lot of the problems or challenges you're currently grappling with. Or the flip side of that, which can be a problem of maybe addressing everybody's individual issues with different tools and processes, but not really looking at the picture that this isn't going to maybe make it easier because now you've got Band-Aids and bubble gum all over it. Everybody thinks they got what they want, but you didn't solve the bigger solution with that. So in my experience, I guess I would really encourage people whenever possible to look at something in a very panned out way that can address the larger overall business needs and see how much of kind of a ripple or trickle through it can happen from that, and then what pockets are left, versus trying to build from the pockets first and realizing, wait a second, we spent all this time and money addressing all of these separate needs, but it doesn't hang together. That creates a bigger problem, and it can be a huge investment burn. Yeah.
And one of the other things that I've felt is quite difficult sometimes is where you bring in a software that might be touching the entire business, but one department is potentially having to do some extra work at this point, but the benefit to the overall company is astronomical, because by this person doing the work at the front, where it normally was this person maybe at 0.6 who was suddenly going, oh, I better key some information in here to process royalties, for example, as opposed to it maybe being done at the acquisition time. Then when it comes time to running your royalty statements and other things, there's all of this trying to back and forth about what the real contract was, what's in the financial royalty system, what's being paid to the authors, is it part of your rights? Have you got your rights income involved? Is everything integrated? Those sorts of challenges. Do you, communicating to people, how important is it for the top level management to be able to help each department to understand the value to the company, not just their department?
I think it's huge. I really do. I mean, I'm a big proponent of utilizing our IP as extensively and effectively and quickly as possible. And if you don't have the right system in place, the right solution in place, and an both upstream and downstream understanding of what that means, then you're setting yourself up to miss opportunities all the time, really. And I think about some of the things that have come up, very quickly in the last 12 months, especially if there was a shift to utilize something in a digital way that had been really stronger in print. If you have to go on a wild goose chase in your rights and royalty system to figure out what is this thing? What do we have? What don't we have? How are we going to get it out to market? You're put in a position of, really kind of a couple of things. Either you just punt and hope for the best and go back and clean it up afterwards while it's out there, or you miss the opportunity to move on that while you're doing that legwork and really figuring out what you have. So it's really critical that everybody understands across the board why that's important, why that visibility and accessibility to that information is important, not just when royalty payments roll around, but the other 10 months of the year as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, for us as a software provider and consulting company, we come across many publishers and we look at many different workflows and things like that. And it is sometimes difficult because you see some people really want to change and others don't. And I think it was interesting when you're talking about the fiefdoms and that people build in companies, that the overall value to the company trying to get people to think that being part of a team, which is the team of the company. And I think, with the pandemic and a lot of, publishers have had to let people go, that people are in a point now where they're actually open to change because it's a matter of survival. If publishers do not change, they will not survive. It's even more, I guess, scary than things like the onset of the ebooks and adapting to that. It's like all channels are changing, and people don't necessarily break down the value of, you mentioned about IP. If you got a sale of a right sale of $50,000, for example, that $50,000 is probably a whole lot more profitable to you than selling, 5,000 books. But you might respect the order of 5,000 books more, just purely because that's the way you've always been taught to view your profitability. So changing not just processes, but changing the mindset of the valuation of IP in companies so that they can really understand what assets they have and how to best promote them.
Definitely. And that gets back, I think, to, my question and point around, some of our publishing bad habits and past sins. The reality that we do have so many P&Ls tied to that traditional print first piece of things, I think boxes in some of our thinking about how can this content work, how can this IP work, and being able to look at it more flexibly really is an exercise in innovation. And I think, some parts of change, when managed well, really get to that area of innovation, and innovation is how we're going to survive. So it has to be a critical piece of this work as well.
Brian, I see you've popped on.
We have a few questions that I'd love to be able to pose to the two of you from the folks who are on the webinar today. Maybe we'll get a couple more before we finish. One actually is just a question from Victoria about a term that you used a couple of times, Patricia. Could you explain what you mean by fiefdoms? What are they in publishing?
Definitely. In publishing, with regard to fiefdoms, what I mean is an area in the business where possibly, and I'll use metadata as an example, where if the team who's in charge of metadata or owns metadata doesn't have maybe the best system in place or the tools in place, maybe they're living in spreadsheet purgatory to manage what they're doing, gets to a place where they very tightly control that information, and other people within the group or the company can't access it without going through those people, and those people are very, very resistant to change because they're trying to protect that area of the business or that information. It really creates that fiefdom, and I've seen it in lots of different pockets, and it's almost always because there's a tool that's missing or a process that's become really convoluted. But it's really that people and team culture around, don't touch my stuff, this is my stuff, you have to come through me to get to this stuff, I'm gonna swat your hand if you touch my stuff. And it can be a big red flag for obviously not just cultural purposes or reasons, but because of what is creating or causing that fiefdom.
Yeah, go ahead, Rod. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, there's a couple of like real little examples there of, they come across as someone's role or department is to assign ISBNs, and they've got an Excel list of all the ISBNs that they've got. And, you say, well, you know what, there's a workflow that you could do that the system would generate the ISBN for you automatically based on your ISBN pool. And they're like, no, I am the one who puts the ISBN, that is my role, but that's not really a role. That's just something that they have inherited, and that's what their role, but they could be doing something much more efficiently. Or you find people updating a schedule for everyone instead of like 10 people being able to interact with the schedule and update their parts. It's like you've got to email someone who then updates this master schedule, and this person really just becomes a manager of dates, where if everyone updated their own schedule, they'd be able to do other things. And they're the sorts of fiefdoms of owning particular sets of data that shouldn't be owned by one specific person.
Yeah. Yep.
Patricia, before I go to the next question, I know that you mentioned before that you have resources that you wanted to share with the people who are there. You might be a good time to just show that screen.
Here we go.
And if you want to say anything about it before we ask you.
Definitely. Yeah, this is a few things that I thought would be useful to reference for folks. There are a couple of white papers in here as well, both the first and the last on this list in terms of change management and also what we're looking at for challenges and opportunities within the mix. And then a couple of books as well that I'm a big fan of. Everything in Its Place by Dan Charnas and also Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. Both of these books I think are useful in the space of thinking about our perfectionism struggles in the industry and also some different methodologies that we can apply to address those and to work on that change within ourselves and our spaces and our teams and move forward. There is the cost calculator that I mentioned there. If you want to use that to get to some hard numbers to speak to folks on your team with. And then Raj, you'll probably laugh at me, but I did put a plug in here for the Virtue Sales Process Chevron. I love this thing. It's a gorgeous chevron that very cleanly shows what I think could be a baseline workflow mind space from how we could be.
Isn't that a tattoo? Isn't that a tattoo you've got?
I haven't gotten it tattooed yet, but I'm thinking about it. I don't want to do it in 2020 because it seems dangerous, but in 21 I'll definitely get that.
Okay, thanks. And you can leave those up so that people who have an interest, and thanks for the plug on our workflow paper. We're pretty happy with that. It came out last fall. A second question, and this is a kind of something to maybe challenge you a bit. Gita was asking, is it possible or could you see a way to apply this change management model to inequality or lack of diversity in book publishing? Is that a problem that you could see it?
That's a really
how might you tackle it?
That's a really good question. I think the two are probably inextricably linked because we have been an industry that changes slowly and we're somewhat change resistant. In some ways, while we've been making good progress, not great, but good progress, I think over the last 5 years in evolving the lists and the publishing mix-up, we haven't done the same work under the hood, if you will, in a lot of these processes and systems. And I think by missing that piece of it, we're obviously missing additional fresh ideas in terms of how this could look better for us. So it's definitely a piece of it. And it's nice to hear a question on that. We'd actually talked about addressing that in the white paper that I just finished. And it feels like it's such a big piece of it, it needed its own space. So I intentionally didn't address it in there because it needs to be addressed more broadly.
Okay, thanks. Catherine was asking if you were aware of any data on the changes in morale due to the pandemic. Potentially, I imagine a decline in morale due to the pandemic.
That's a great question. I don't have hard numbers right here handy, but I have been looking at numbers in terms of definitely an overall decline, which probably doesn't surprise anyone. I think it's also tied into how many organizations have had to do layoffs and reduce overall headcount and restructuring. And I think there's a general sense and concern that there is a floating pool of great talent out there right now that doesn't know where it's going to land. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how the first half of 21 shakes out in that space. And I would love to actually dig up some numbers on that because I don't have, as I said, I don't have them right here, but it's definitely there. And it's not necessarily in the happy, shiny side.
And perhaps close to home for you, Anne is asking if you think that educational publishers are particularly susceptible to the notion that they need a non-standard workflow.
That question almost feels loaded for me. I do think it's there, and it's kind of ironic that it is as strong as it is in educational publishers, because there is a lot that can be standardized in that, and actually organically has ended up paralleling itself between organizations. But because those particular organizations tend to hold things so close to the vest, I don't know that there is broad visibility in terms of just how much of it is actually very similar and could be easily standardized and cleaned up.
Yeah, I mean, Anna points out that education kind of straddles both traditional trade in many cases and the librarian or institutional classroom needs, and so therefore it can get locked.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And Rachel's
Brian,
at, go ahead, Rob.
sorry, go on.
No, I just had another question, that's all.
Well, no, we'll get Rachel's question. I just want to add a point to the sort of the whole thing with the pandemic and the amount of change that's happened. That actually there's a lot of people that we deal with now are actually for their roles. So there's personal and there's business, and I actually think on the business side, it's actually equaled up a lot of people's roles, because we've just as simple things as people have gone from, hey, we want to print out this report, to being, do you know what, we don't need to print it out anymore because everyone's online. So they're actually, people are dynamically changing their workflows, that if they tried to change that a year ago, it would have taken 6 months of deliberation and talking, and we always print out these things for our meeting, and we've got to have it printed out. It's got to be on this A4, and it's got this box has got to be here, and this data, you know. But people now are like, well, actually, it's not that important, and so people are changing their processes, like we're talking in this, without even knowing they're doing it, but they were forced to do it, and so people are just open. So the other thing is, like, sort of meetings and online meetings. People are all at their computers. They're all working on where before they go to a meeting with a piece of paper. And so, you know, a lot of people we deal with are finding that for particular roles, they're actually enjoying the structure for some things. They'd obviously like to be able to meet and not get sick and have the social interaction, but actually for the purpose of getting work done, sometimes now that it's online, that it's become a lot simpler for them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The question I did have from Rachel was something simpler. It's with respect to fear of automation. You know, do you have suggestions on how to address it? She adds the observation that in some cases fiefdoms are formed around the idea that an aspect of change, you know, moving from people to systems, as an example, will put them out of a job. So how do you tackle that in real world situations?
That is a great question, and that's something that I've definitely encountered more than once. And it gets a little bit to what Rod was noting earlier. The system can sometimes be liberating to more creative or innovative things, rather than just a fear of, well, if this goes away, my job goes away. And that's where I think it's really important in the communication piece of this, and being real about the work and the message, is creating opportunities for people to upskill within the business, and getting people to the table and being very real and showing working examples of what the technology or the system can do. And yes, it is going to replace X, Y, and Z steps, and it's going to create this much time. And with that time, would you be interested in doing this or that or whatnot? And you know, I think there's a truth, especially with, I'll just continue to use the metadata example. You know, people who are babysitting data right now versus doing quality assurance, QA on it, and adding to the business to discoverability level, for example. And so whenever there's a space where the technology seems like it's going to take away somebody's job and it's naturally creating that fear, there should also be an exploration around what else is this person interested in? What other skills are they bringing to the table? What other needs are we not getting to as a business that we have resources for, but those resources are getting burned on things that really should be automated, and we could move them over here to do this work instead. And that doesn't mean it's going to protect every single position in the mix. Some of this stuff and change will create occasionally reductions in roles in certain spots, but it should also create spaces for innovation and other work as well.
And if I could just add one last question before we close, the first paper that you wrote, the change management amid unrelenting change, is that paper available now?
I believe it is. Rob, do you know if that's?
Yeah, it will be available, and we will send a link out to all the people who have registered and attended this session.
Fantastic. That's great news. I really appreciate that. We're just at time, so I want to thank you, Patricia, for putting your thoughts together and creating this presentation, and to you, Rod, for teasing out some of the aspects of Patricia's Minnesota speed talking and giving her a second bite at the apple. I think that's really important, and as well as sharing Virtue Sales' own experience in this, because it is a core part of what you do in introducing systems to all of your clients, and it's an opportunity to show that this is part of an integrated way of improving publishing going forward.
Absolutely. Very
Thanks
welcome.
for your time, you guys. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. All the best,
Thank you.
and have a good holiday.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You too.